Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Western Spirit. Today, we're with a very special guest and someone who I followed for, I guess, a pretty long time, Brendan O'Neill. Brendan is the chief political writer for the British magazine Spiked, and he was its chief editor for 15 years. Brendan is also a host of the host of the Brendan O'Neill Show podcast, and also writes regularly in a number of publications, including The Spectator, The Daily Mail, and The New York Post, which is my hometown paper growing up in New York. Best paper in New York, by the way. Brendan has been writing and speaking a lot about what's happening here in Israel and in Europe at large in terms of the Jewish people, anti-Semitism, and all that. And Brendan is coming out with a new book about the issue, and the name of the book is After the Pogrom, 7th of October, Israel and the Crisis of Civilization. And so, Brendan, I hope I got all that right. It's amazing to speak with you finally.
Thank you. My pleasure, Ariel. Good to talk to you.
Yes. So, Brendan, before we get into, I guess, I'm in Israel, we're really at a tipping point here about what's going to happen in Gaza and all that. The cabinet is going to meet today. We're recording this on Tuesday, and the government is going to meet today to decide what's happening. But before we get into that, I want to ask you, for anyone who hears you have an Irish accent, and one of the things that I never understood is, why do the Irish in general don't dislike us so much? What do they have against us? There's literally almost no Jews left in Ireland. They pretty much all ran away. I understand there's like this oppressor-oppressed narrative where because of history, the Irish against the British and all this kind of stuff. But you could just as easily look at the Israelis as the oppressed in the same type of way. So what is happening? And I know you've written about it a lot.
Yeah, I have. I don't actually have an Irish accent, but I have I have an Irish name.
Yes.
My accent is quite British, quite London. My parents are Irish. I was born in London. I'm a first-generation Briton. I love Ireland. I'm very proud to be Irish. I go there 3 or 4 times a year to visit family, visit friends. It's one of my favorite places in the world, but it's in big trouble right now. It's politically, morally in big trouble. The Israelophobia there is insane, and it often crosses the line into outright anti-Semitism. It's really weird. It's interesting that you mentioned that the justification that lots of Irish people will give for why they hate Israel is because of what you've just said, that we Irish people have this specific history. We were oppressed and ruled by the British Empire for a very long time. We had to fight against the British Empire for the liberty, certainly in the south of the country, if not in the north. So they say that's why we identify with the Palestinians, because they are now in a similar relationship with the evil empire of Israel. I don't buy this at all. I think it is complete hogwash. It's historically illiterate. You're absolutely right to suggest that, in fact, Ireland has more in common with Israel than it does with the Palestinians. And in fact, if you look back at the Jewish revolutionaries who fought against the British in the 1940s, it was very similar to what the Irish did in the 1910s. The Irish rose up against the British Empire in 1916, and then again in a war of independence in 1921. And it was very similar to what the Jews did a couple of decades later. And in fact, a lot of those Jewish revolutionaries were very much inspired by what the Irish had done. One of the leading revolutionaries in the Jewish uprising against the British Mandate, his code name was Michael, after Michael Collins, who's a famous leader of the Irish War of Independence. Irish, the first ever Jewish Lord Mayor of Dublin during the War of Independence in Ireland. He was the very well-known Jewish man. He helped to fund the War of Independence, and he later went to Israel, to this newborn state, to give advice to the revolutionaries on how they could become political parties, what they might do next. So there's a lot of interplay between these two nations, and there's a lot of similarities. Ireland and Israel are both small, plucky nations that have a historic yearning for freedom. In both cases, a ragtag militia managed to overthrow the the most powerful empire in human history. In Ireland, it was a bunch of revolutionaries who took over the General Post Office in Dublin in Easter 1916. In Israel, it was even more extraordinary. It was people who had survived the Holocaust or who had fled Europe, who then managed to take up arms to re-establish their ancient homeland. Both countries have a diaspora around the world. Famously, the Irish and the Jews are scattered across the four corners of the earth. So for many decades, Ireland and Israel were seen as having a lot in common. And in fact, in Ireland, there was some respect for Israel in the 1900s, in the mid 20th century, right up to, I would say, 1967, 1973. All through that period, Ireland did see Israel as a similar nation to itself. But things start to turn in the 1970s and the 1980s. The Palestinian cause, as it's called, becomes more popular. There's a lot of Soviet propaganda saying that the Palestinians are the best and the Israelis are the worst. The left across Europe starts to adopt that really narrow oppressor narrative, and they squeeze everything into that box, even if it doesn't quite fit. So something turned, something twisted, and Ireland then went from being quite favourable towards Israel to being frothingly hateful towards Israel. And I see that now when I go there, and it worries me enormously.
But is it like, when you walk around Ireland, how do you see it? Because I met a few people who are Irish Jews, and they said they're scared to wear Jewish, like a kippah in the street or a Star of David. They literally are worried about being physically assaulted or physically accosted or whatever you want to call it. They just don't want the hassle, so they'll just put their kippah in their pocket. It's like, it's almost like a silent type of giving in to the mob.
There is, the way I've described it is that it feels like Israelophobia is Ireland's new religion. Ireland was famously a Catholic country for a long time. Catholicism has withered in Ireland. It's no longer in control in the way that it used to be a few decades ago. And it feels like Israelophobia has become a kind of religion substitute. And Israel now plays the role that Satan once played. If you were brought up in Ireland from the 1920s, really right through to the 1980s, you would be a very religious person. You'd be quite a pious person. You would pray to God regularly. You would be scared of the devil. I used to go there as a child. I remember there were statues of the Virgin Mother on the side of the road, and you would stop your car and get out and say a prayer and then get back into your car. It was a very religious country. And when that falls apart, when Catholicism goes into crisis, which is what's happened in Ireland, people look around for a substitute. They look around for another straightforward moral narrative around which they might organize their lives. And some people have latched on to Israelophobia. Israel now plays the role of evil, and the Palestinians play the role of the pure people, the good people, the people we must save. If you're a righteous person, you must seek to save these people. It really does have a religious overtone to it, this Israelophobia. And when I was in Ireland a couple of months ago, what I noticed is that there's no longer statues of the Virgin Mother on the sides of the road. They're all gone. But there are Palestine flags everywhere. I mean, I'm not just talking about Dublin and Cork, the big cities, but also in fields in the middle of nowhere. My parents come from the extreme west of Ireland, which is beautiful and windswept and incredibly rural. There's not much there at all. It's a wonderful place. But I was driving in that part of the country, and you would just see a Palestine flag, tied into a fence in a field. And you'd see it hanging from a pub in the middle of nowhere. The only thing within a 10-mile radius is this pub, and it still had the Palestine flag. So it's incredibly pronounced. You see it across the whole country, and it has become, I think it's more pronounced amongst the city elites for sure. I think in Dublin, it's inescapable. It's almost choking. You can't walk 5 meters in Dublin without seeing someone in a keffiyeh or without seeing Palestine graffiti. It's everywhere. And the Irish media is obsessed with Israel to an extraordinary degree. The Irish Times is completely and utterly obsessed with hating Israel. So it's much more pronounced in the cities amongst the kind of influential sections of society, but it is also fairly widespread in the country. And I do think it's become a Catholicism substitute. I do think it's become a new religious ethos. And it's very worrying and destabilizing. And I think it is definitely frightening for Irish Jews. I think there are between 2,000 and 3,000 Jews in Ireland, so not many. Um, and they are worried. They've seen video footage of Jewish people being abused, which has happened a few times recently. They saw the Israeli embassy withdraw from Ireland because it said Ireland is now an institutionally anti Semitic country. They've seen the Irish president, Michael D. Higgins, hijack a Holocaust memorial event to talk about Gaza. They see all of this and they think, what's happened to this country where we were, relatively safe and relatively comfortable for a long time? So it's very worrying. And I think Ireland is an example of where other European countries will go if they don't keep a check on this Israelophobia.
Yes, and that is my next. That's a great segue to my next topic, which I wanted to ask you. It is probably the same topic, just on a broader level. You wrote in the Spectator an article in the last few days about the horrible video that we just saw, the Hamas released of Evyatar David. And in the video, for those who don't know, Evyatar, who's a hostage, you can see photos of him before he was taken hostage, just a few days before, or even I think in the Nova party, there's a picture of his. So on the day that he was abducted, and he looks vibrant and healthy and in very good shape. And now in the video they released, he looks like my grandfather and grandmother were in the Holocaust. That's pretty much the way he looks. And he's digging his own grave. They're obviously telling him what to do, and he's telling them, I'm digging my own grave. And it's obviously meant to try to pressure Israeli public opinion to end the war and bring back the hostages and all this, which is a different topic. But you explain in your article how the European country, the Western world basically, is rewarding Hamas for this type of thing. Can you just explain?
Yeah, it's extraordinary. I was thinking to myself, we know why Hamas would do this to Aviatar David and also Ron Braslavsky. We know why it would kidnap, abduct these two young Jews and force them underground and make them and starve them. It would do that because it is an anti-Semitic organization that is devoted to the persecution and the murder of Jewish people. We know why it would use their gaunt images to taunt Israel, to horrify people in Israel, because it is devoted to the destruction of the Jewish state. So we understand why Hamas would behave in such a wicked, evil way. But I've been thinking to myself, why is Hamas so proud of what it did? Why is it content to release the footage? It's one thing to mimic the Nazis and to treat Jews like this, but it's another thing to boast about it and to show it to the world and to say, look what we've done to these two Jews. We've destroyed them. And I was thinking, why is Hamas content to release the footage? And it made me realize that it's because Hamas has been emboldened. Hamas now knows that it doesn't get blamed for anything. In the Western influencer circles, amongst the Western media and the activist classes here, everything is blamed on Israel. Hamas is seen as a blameless party. This whole Gaza conflict, the whole Gaza horror, is seen as the sole responsibility of Israel, which of course is entirely false. This is a war that was started by Hamas, that is still being fought by Hamas, and that is carrying on because Hamas refuses to release the hostages and refuses to surrender to the more powerful army. This is a war of Hamas's making, and it's a war that's carrying on because of Hamas's behavior. But in the West, it's understood as something that is entirely down to Israel. So Hamas feels so confident that it won't be blamed, that it won't be held morally responsible, that it will still be let off the hook, that it even feels confident enough to release images that are reminiscent of Nazi Europe. That's the situation we're in. We have emboldened Hamas. And the fact that they released the images of those two young men in the days after Keir Starmer, Emmanuel Macron, and Mark Carney promised to recognize the state of Palestine, that was extraordinarily revealing and also quite sickening.
And by the way, Brendan, if I can interject, the Razi Hamed, which I think is the number one or number two of Hamas in Qatar, which is, by the way, an amazing phenomenon in and of itself, that there's a country that is giving these people who are responsible for what's happening right now in Gaza with all the famine that we keep on hearing about and the horrible conditions and the death and the starvation, all this, the people in charge of it are sitting in Qatar in these 4-star hotels and just living their lives and with the good pools and saunas and everything. And so he was on TV, I think in Al Jazeera, which again is a Qatari based TV station owned by the government pretty much. And he says, if we wouldn't have done October 7th, no one would recognize the Palestinian state. So this is proof. And from his point of view, he doesn't care about how many people died in Gaza. So this is proof that we did the righteous thing. We did a good thing by killing 1,200 plus Israelis and kidnapping over 200 and who knows what, as sexual abuse to women and all this kind of stuff that we've learned since. And they're happy about it because their proof is what the Europeans are doing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's exactly right. He referred to it as the fruits of 7th of October. So he sees it very clearly. He sees Starmer and Macron and also Carney as rewarding Hamas for its barbarism, as rewarding Hamas's savagery by gifting Hamas with a state. Now, of course, all three of those leaders in the West, they all paid lip service to the importance of disarming Hamas. They all said, of course, Hamas has to disarm and get out of the way.
Or what? That's always, or what?
Exactly, or what? So firstly, it's a hollow threat, or it's a hollow gesture. But more to the point, Hamas still exists right now. And to give the gift of statehood to a territory that is part controlled by this fascistic army, to a territory that is part controlled by these barbarous militants who are starving Jews in the manner of the Nazis, to give a territory like that statehood is, to my mind, absolutely unforgivable. It is the worst political mistake these leaders have made, and that's saying something because these people have made a lot of mistakes. It's extraordinary and it's unforgivable, and it's not surprising at all that Hamas is over the moon. They are thrilled by what's happened because they recognize the truth of what's happened, which is that Starmer, Macron, and Carney have sent the message that killing Jews has benefits, that anti-Semitic savagery has benefits. If you kill Jews and rape Jews and kidnap Jews, you might just get your own nation. That's what Hamas has heard, and that's what Hamas is right to have heard, because it sees the whole idea of a Palestinian state being sped up more by 7th of October than by any other recent event. So it has taken the message that anti-Semitic savagery has consequences that are positive for it and its power and its rule and its control, and it now recognizes that such a pogrom is very wounding to Israel, not only because of what happened on 7th of October, but also because Western leaders are now taking the side of Palestine and giving it its own state. It's atrocious what they've done. They have emboldened one of the most evil armies on earth, and I think they should be held to account for that.
But it's even worse than that, if I can just and get your just if you agree or not. The fact is, we now know that they were really on the verge of getting some sort of ceasefire, and Israel gave so much up. From an Israeli standpoint, I am very critical about the government being so weak in the negotiations, but because of internal pressure, outside pressure, the government is like, please give us a deal, giving Hamas almost everything it wants, except for the explicit promise with international guarantees that we won't end the war. That's basically it. And the second they started hearing this, they basically pulled out of the deal, Hamas. And the reason is they are getting everything they want without a deal. And so in a way, the European leaders who say they're so, they want this war to end, the plight of the Palestinians, they are prolonging the war by showing Hamas that the war is worth it for them. Hamas is looking at this and saying, we are getting so much out of this war. We don't care about dead people, starving people. It's even better for us. The more starving people, the more dead people, the more suffering and pictures are on Western TV, the more, first of all, we're hurting Israel, which is our number one priority. But secondly, we're getting Palestinian countries to recognize Palestine. We're getting tons of money and stuff to Palestinian organizations all over the world. Israel is being more and more isolated. Why not? Let's continue. And so in a way, these people are hurting the people they're claiming to help.
Oh, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. These Western leaders have incentivized Hamas's warmongering. They've given Hamas extra motivation to carry on doing what it's doing. Look at what Keir Starmer has done. Keir Starmer hasn't just said, I recognize the state of Palestine. He's done something even worse than that. He says, I will recognize the state of Palestine in September unless there's a ceasefire in Gaza. So What this means is that Hamas now has a very clear motivation for there to be no ceasefire.
Exactly.
And it is now has been given a green light by the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom to carry on with the war, to refuse to sign up to any ceasefire negotiations or any ceasefire, and to carry on allowing destruction to take place because it benefits from the more dead Palestinians there are, the better it is for Hamas because it uses those awful deaths as a weapon, as a tool against Israel, and as a way of winning over support from idiots in the West. So all Hamas now has to do is carry on dragging the war out, say no to every ceasefire deal, allow people to go hungry or to be injured or to be killed, because it knows that come September, this powerful country called Britain will recognize the state of Palestine, and that will be good for Hamas and bad for Israel. So, I think every death in Gaza is the moral responsibility of Hamas because it started this war and it refuses to end it. I now think for the next 2 months, those deaths are also the moral responsibility of Keir Starmer because he has given a green light to Hamas to push aside ceasefire talks and to carry on with its barbaric activities. We know for a fact because Hamas openly says this. Numerous Hamas leaders have said that they don't care how many Palestinian people die. They refer to them as a nation of martyrs, and they see those deaths as morally and politically beneficial to their cause because they know that the deaths will be shown on the British media morning, noon, and night, the American media, they'll be on social media. They know it will drum up more and more hatred for Israel, maybe even more and more anti-Semitism. They use the suffering of people in Gaza, and there is undoubted suffering of people in Gaza. How could there not be when Hamas brought a war to this tiny little enclave? They weaponize that suffering, and they are incentivized to create more of that suffering because useful idiots in the West line up with them against Israel and say, yes, you are the oppressed people and Israel is the most evil country in the world. So Starmer has now joined that cause of incentivizing Hamas to carry on with its anti-Semitic savagery and its anti-Palestinian antics.
Exactly.
And that's really unforgivable.
Brendan, then if all this is true, and it is true, why is he doing it? And so this is the more internal European phenomena that you have written about. You speak about this a lot. And I think maybe two things. Number one is, and tell me if you agree with me, and then you'll elaborate, especially in the UK where you live and you report on. So number one is the fact that the left in the entire Western world has moved towards a colonialist, anti-colonialist type of mindset, this woke type of ideology, which looks at every situation in terms of oppressor and oppressed, and the oppressor is always the one who's more successful. The oppressed is the weaker one. No, it doesn't even matter historically. It doesn't matter. If you're stronger and he's weaker, you're automatically in the wrong. I think that is the number one issue. And the second thing is the immigration issue. And so we see in lots of European countries an extreme amount of immigrants from radical Muslim countries. And we also see a extreme drop, and this has something to do with what you were speaking about earlier in Ireland, in the birth rates of the local communities, so to speak. So I'm just looking, none of the European countries at this point are even close to replacement rates. And the younger generation are comprised of a lot of immigrants. And so the new up and coming voters are people who hate Israel and hate Jews, a lot of them. And so tell me if you agree. I don't know, but that's just the way I see it from here. And so what is happening internally? And am I right to see it basically the way I do now?
I think, yes. I think with Starmer, there are two reasons why he took this action of saying of blackmailing Israel. That's what he's done. He's essentially blackmailing a supposed ally and saying, if you don't take these various actions, then we will do the thing you don't want us to do. It's moral blackmail masquerading as diplomacy. That's what he's done. And I think there are two reasons for it. Firstly, because he faces a backbench revolt. His backbench MPs, his kind of broader party of members of parliament, are bristling with anger over Israel because a lot of them are Israelophobic and a lot of them are just, if I'm allowed to say this, a lot of them are just a bit dumb. They don't know the truth of this region. They don't know the truth of the history or anything else. They go along with the general view that Israel is the cause of all the problems. So he was facing a revolt from his own members of parliament. and he wanted to offset that. He wanted to throw them a bit of red meat to keep them calm, to keep them happy. And he's also trying to placate Muslim voters, because Labour has become increasingly reliant on the Muslim vote to maintain its quite frail power. You know, Labour has lost the working class vote. You know, this is a party that was founded to represent the working classes of Britain. It no longer does that. In fact, it looks down its nose at them. It treats them with contempt. It sees them as stupid, xenophobic idiots. So the working classes have pretty much abandoned Labour. They now are more likely to vote for the Conservative Party, or more recently for Nigel Farage's Reform Party. They've left Labour. So Labour has increasingly become reliant on the votes of younger, upper middle class people, students, and Muslims. That's this kind of unholy alliance that is what
That's also in the US where I come from. The Democrats now are either the uber rich or the uber poor.
That's it.
It's like
exactly right.
Everybody in the middle is voting for Trump at this point,
yeah.
Even if you're a minority in some of these cases.
Very similar dynamic in the UK and in many European countries,
yes.
In fact, where the old social democratic parties have been abandoned, quite rightly, I think, by working class people. And so Labour is very worried about the Muslim vote. It's worried that it might lose it, and therefore it would lose seats. So it's placating the Muslim vote as well. So to put this into perspective, Keir Starmer has abandoned our ally of Israel in one of the darkest moments of its history in order to make his own life that bit easier. He has thrown Israel under the bus. He has stabbed it in the back, to mix my metaphors, in order to placate his own stupid MPs and in order to continue winning votes from certain sections of the Muslim community. That's what he has done. And that is a really low form of politics. That is the lowest form of politics, where Israel is fighting an existential war for its continued existence and its continued flourishing. And Britain, which is supposed to be its friend, has basically said to it, if you don't jump through all these hoops, we're going to do that terrible, terrible thing you would rather we didn't do. And he's doing that in order to make his own life here in Britain a bit more comfortable. So it's really awful behavior.
But can I ask you I know Douglas Murray was on your show not too long ago, and he has said, multiple times I've listened and read him saying that he's more worried about the UK's future than Israel's future. And the reason that he gave was one of the reasons, I guess, was the number one was that the elites, I think, are like totally detached from reality and from helping their own citizens. And therefore, and then the second thing is like an offshoot of that is the immigration problem in the West, which at this point in places like the UK, I don't know that there's any way to fix it because the numbers are too large. And like you just demonstrated politically, they have enormous political capital at this point. Large immigrant communities banded together. I was thinking about it that in the last UK elections, there actually are members of the UK Parliament, independents, that are sitting in your Parliament that were voted into Parliament on just the Gaza issue. And so not we're going to fix your potholes, we're going to make life easier for you, school is going to be better, we're going to the NHS, the healthcare system, we're going to make it better, whatever. No, we're going to do something about Gaza in the UK Parliament. And once that happens, what can you do already?
Yeah, the immigration issue in Britain is out of control. It's out of control. And, we currently have young men arriving here mostly from regressive cultures around the world, from parts of the world where women are treated like dirt, where homosexuals are killed or at least persecuted, where freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and anything else just don't exist and are looked down upon as stupid Western ideas. We're hundreds and hundreds of young, able-bodied, physically fit men arrive from those cultures on the shores of Britain every single day. Hundreds every day. There was a Saturday in May when 1,200 turned up in small boats on the shores of Kent. So hundreds are coming every single day. I mean, that is extraordinary. And they are being put up in hotels. They're being given bed and board, 3 meals a day, a nice room in a hotel.
And you're paying for it, the taxpayer.
And we're paying for it. And it really has come to breaking point because British people are now starting to protest at these hotels. There have been massive protests at various hotels across the country over the past 2 weeks because they've had enough. And they want our government to protect the borders. You know, the basic premise of a free democratic nation is that you know who and what is crossing your borders. You know what is being imported in terms of goods and products, and you know who is coming here in terms of people. That is the basic premise of a sovereign nation. If you don't have that, then you are not a really, truly sovereign nation. So these protests, they're not xenophobic protests, as the media says. They're not racist protests. They're people saying, we don't want our local hotel to be completely occupied by men who we don't know, who turned up overnight and who entered this country illegally and who might pose a threat to the community, because a lot of these men have been charged with serious crimes in the local communities in which the government has put them. And they're also saying we want Britain, the government, to do more to preserve British sovereignty, to protect our borders, to defend the nation. You know, the problem is really summed up by recent events in France, where they've brought in some people from Gaza to give them refuge, to give them asylum. They've now called that off because one of the young women they brought in, who came to France and she was going to study there and she was given refuge, etc., she turned out to be a raging anti-Semite. She posted
Surprise.
Commentary. You know, this is what when you get educated in UNRWA-run schools and you are governed by Hamas, lo and behold, there's a high likelihood you'll be an anti-Semite. She posted anti-Semitic comments. She praised terrorist organizations, and France said to her, right, get the hell out of here. That's a sensible thing for France to do. You know, France has a load of current problems. It also has a long history of some of the most lethal anti-Semitism of all time, you know, next to Germany, of course. You know, right from the Dreyfus affair through to Vichy France and so on, and even longer ago than that. And so I think it's been rightly cautious about not importing more of this kind of hatred. So I think that's probably the right decision for it to make. And it's now put a halt to these arrivals until it has a better vetting system or until it understands what's going on. But that's the problem of Europe summed up.
But
It's
Brendan,
bringing in
can I just
people.
one thing that as you were speaking about, I was just thinking that I just interviewed Bezalel Smotrich, who's the finance minister of Israel, member of the cabinet. The Western media really doesn't like him because of his stances on Gaza, which I can accept. I don't agree with him on everything, but he was sanctioned by the UK, meaning if he had and he. I asked him about it. I said, "Do you have any money in the UK?" And he said, "Not really, so I don't really care." But but he said, but if he like would come to the UK, I assume he'd be arrested. I'm pretty sure, or his assets would be seized if for some reason they would somehow wind up there. And at the same time, you have these people who literally hate Jews that are being. It's just a weird. I didn't even think about it until now. That are being given hotels and all this kind of stuff. And Smotrich, whether you like him or not, he's a minister of the government of your allies. He's maybe said things that I disagree with, that you might disagree with, but you know, I remember when Geert Wilders wasn't allowed in the UK. Now they're going to allow him in because they don't want to fight with the Netherlands. So why would you like? You get my point. It's like
Yeah.
a double standard in a very weird way.
Yeah. There are things I disagree with Smotrich on for sure, no question. But you're absolutely right. It's just this extraordinary state of affairs where the government will basically put up a huge tall fence for certain Israeli ministers and say, you can't come here. While at the exact same time, today, for example, right, on this fine sunny day in Britain, I don't know, maybe 500 people will turn up, 700, 800. They will just turn up in boats crossing from France. They will all be from mostly from Muslim countries. They will be from North Africa. They might be from the Middle East. They will predominantly be young men. We don't know who they are. We don't know what their history is. We don't know if they've been involved in Islamic terrorism. We don't know if they've committed crimes. They will turn up today, hundreds of them, on this very day that you and I are speaking, and they will be put up in a 3 or 4 star hotel in a local community that doesn't want them there. And that's happening every single day of the week, every single week of the year. And at the same time, we say to certain ministers from Israel, well, you can't come here because you've said some things that are just too controversial. It's absolutely absurd and ridiculous, and really sums up the virtue signaling involved in a lot of this, where, Keir Starmer and his government thinks they can win some brownie points amongst the tweeting classes if they say, well, you can't come because you're a bad Israeli person. But at the same time, they've just opened the borders. They've thrown them open to people from overseas, and it's really quite shocking.
But also, and this is the last we'll talk about this, but also there are in the UK actual people who are pro-Hamas, like that have been let in by, not illegally, legally let in. Like I remember Douglas Murray, again, I'm mentioning him. He's a few times spoke about some guy in London that is one of the founders of Hamas that just lives openly in London. And you have all these crazy preachers that have been saying in mosques all over the UK, kill the Jews, all this kind of stuff, and no one even thinks about it. And this is the segue to another article that I read that you wrote, and so you can see that I read a lot of your stuff about the double standard of free speech in the UK. And so you'll have all these really crazy, fanatical, for example, radical Muslims. I'm just speaking about it. And they're saying the horrible things. Most of them will never even be questioned. You mentioned in your article the guy from the Glastonbury Festival, Bob Villan, who said kill the IDF. And he not only said that, he also said like bad things about Zionists, which is obviously a euphemism for a Jewish guy that employed him at some point of his life, and he was going after him to demonstrate how all the Zionists slash Jews, we know what he means, are bad people and all this. And then he also went after the UK itself, which anybody who's in a, you're in the country at the biggest music festival and you're just trashing your own country is like the most horrible thing to do, in my opinion. It's so ungrateful. But anyway, he says all these things. Nothing pretty much happens to him. They said they're opening investigation. I didn't see him betting. He never got arrested, I don't think. And this woman who wrote a horrible tweet, but took it down after a few hours, Lucy Connolly,
Yeah.
she's still in jail.
Yeah.
Months in. And
It's
yeah.
It's extraordinary. It really is. Yeah. So Lucy Connolly wrote a pretty dreadful tweet, actually, during the Southport riots. There were riots here last year following the massacre of 3 girls in Southport who were stabbed to death by the son of Rwandan immigrants. And there was a lot of anger. People were furious that this happened. They were furious that we weren't being told the whole story about what happened, that we weren't being given information about what happened. So riots broke out. They were very destructive, very ugly. Local communities were smashed up and everything. And during those riots, Lucy Connolly wrote a tweet along the lines of, burn down the migrant hotels. I don't care what happens to these people, whatever, something like that. A horrible tweet, right? She was arrested. She
took down the tweet. We should say
she took down the tweet
after a few hours only.
Yeah, she thought, what the hell am I doing? And she took it down. She was arrested. She was convicted of incitement to racial hatred or incitement to violence. And she was sentenced to 31 months in jail. That's a long time for a tweet. Yes. That's a long time for a social media.
She's a middle-aged woman, right? She's not like some radical.
Yeah, she's got kids. She is not some kind of young skinhead fascist or anything like that. So that's a long time in jail for a social media post. And it's caused a huge storm in this country because people are saying, look, this is absurd. Yes, what she wrote was bad, but this is far worse for the state to use its power in this way. And as you say, at the exact same time, there are constant incitements, I think, on anti-Israel marches at Glastonbury, where we heard the chant "Death to the IDF." I've been on some of these anti-Israel marches just to observe them, of course. I would never take part in those hate marches. I've seen, and I've only been on a handful of them just to see what's going on. And even while I've been there, I've seen gangs of young Islamists chanting for the return of the army of Muhammad to kill all Jews. I've seen people holding up placards, of course, saying that Israel is the new Nazis, the Jews are the new Nazis. I've seen people praising Hamas. Famously, just after 7th of October, some protesters were wearing images of paragliders to celebrate the men who paraglided into Israel to rape and kill Jewish people. So I've seen constant celebrations of violence,
And
or
no one's
even
arrested for this.
the three of the young women who wore the paraglider stickers were arrested and were given suspended sentences, so they didn't go to jail, unlike Lucy Connolly. So, but no, lots of people haven't been arrested, and it's, you know, it's even worse than that, because shortly after 7th of October there was a big hate march in London. And on that march, there were radical Islamists, and they were chanting for jihad against the Jewish state. Basically, in my view, they were calling for more 7th of Octobers, more pogroms. And the Metropolitan Police issued a statement saying, well, actually, jihad has many different meanings. It doesn't just mean war, it can also mean personal struggle. They essentially issued a justification for these men chanting for jihad. We all know what they were chanting for. This was a couple of weeks after 7th of October. We know what they meant. They wanted more holy war against the world's only Jewish nation. That's exactly what they meant. But the police were making excuses for them. So it's even worse. Not only do the police arrest and charge and convict someone for writing a really stupid, ugly social media post, they will then make excuses for gangs of people on the streets who are chanting for violence against the Jewish nation. So it's a deeply, deeply disturbing situation. And what it shows, which is incredibly worrying, is that Israelophobia is not just the fashion amongst the activist classes and the overeducated left and young middle class people and radical Islamists. It also is quite rampant within officialdom itself, and that's really worrying.
But is it also that, like, I remember there was videos of Jews or pro-Israel people trying to counter protest, and they get like thrown right out by the Metropolitan Police. Like they get so fast they kick them out. They even threaten a lot of times to arrest them because they are inciting the crazy, violent jihadist protesters. So you would have like one or two guys with an Israeli flag, and the police are coming to them and saying like, hide the flag, go away, you're inciting the people. And so I was thinking that maybe it's a little less, it's more like the mob is so scary, the police have are so impotent and so scared of the mob, and also the racial aspect here where if the white police are seen to be hurting a brown Muslim march, then there's like this sort of thing like with the grooming gangs where a lot of the people were like scared to do anything because maybe they'll be called Islamophobic or racist. So do you think that plays into it a lot?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. You're right in what you're describing. There have been situations where pro Israel counter protesters have been kettled. Kettled is a word for when the police push them into a certain corner and say, you're not allowed outside of these fences. And some have been arrested. You know, there's an Iranian protester here who goes on all the pro-Palestine marches with a banner saying Hamas are terrorists. He's very brave to do that, and it's so interesting because the anti-Israel protesters will go insane. They will always attack him and scream at him and call him a fascist, which just proves that they support
Right.
Hamas, right? And so this guy, this Iranian protester who's very anti-Hamas, very pro-Israel, um, he has been arrested by the police. He's been questioned by the police. There's one video clip of him being virtually assaulted by the police and thrown to the ground, and then they remove his banner saying Hamas are terrorists. That's the law. By the way, it's the law in this country.
Right.
That Hamas
They're
is
a prescribed terrorist
They're a
organization.
prescribed organization as a terrorist group. And so he was basically manhandled by the cops for stating the law of the land. It's so ridiculous. But, you know, yes, it's partly fear of the mob. And it's also a huge part is fear of being accused of racism, fear of being accused of Islamophobia. And just to give you one example of how bad things have got, in Scotland last year, there was a hate march, an anti-Israel march, a supposed pro-Palestine march. I always have to do quote marks for pro-Palestine because if you were really pro-Palestine, you would support the destruction of Hamas. That's the way I see
It's
it.
pro-Hamas march. They
Pro-Hamas.
literally say it at this point.
Yeah. And so there was one of those marches in Scotland, in Edinburgh, and a Jewish man was there. He was walking by. He wasn't on the march. And the police said to him, would you mind removing your Star of David necklace? Because you might and he recorded this. You can hear it, and that he said they said you might antagonize the protesters. Now, since then, the police have issued an apology, as they should. But that's the level we've reached, where the police are advising Jews to hide any signs of their Jewishness, to hide things away, and we've seen that in this country many times over the past 2 years. Near where I live, there's a school called the Jewish Free School, which is a very famous high school here for Jewish kids. After 7th of October, those kids were told that were given permission by their school to remove their blazers on their way to and from school so that no one would recognize them as Jews. It's a big deal in Britain to wear your blazer to school. I remember when I went to school and we had a uniform, you had to wear your blazer when you were out in public. You were representative of the school. It was a big deal. So being told that you could remove your blazer because it has the word Jewish on it is extraordinary. And I think there's been many cases like that where Jewish students at universities have hidden their kippahs under baseball caps. Other Jews have said that they kind of tuck their Star of David necklace under their shirt so no one sees it. This is the climate we now have, where Jews, you mentioned this happening in Ireland over the past 2 years. It's happening in Britain. It's happening in France. It's happening in Germany. We've created this climate of hostility against Jews. And I think that the fact that officialdom is, whether wittingly or unwittingly, stirring that climate up is really bad.
And they know also that it works. So like what we said again, they know that the leaders are watching this, and it's slowly but surely being shown to them that it's worth it to placate to these mobs politically. And so that is why they're doing the Palestinian recognition and all this other sanctions on Israel and not giving Israel weapons and all this kind of thing, which is all for show. Britain doesn't even pretty much sell us anything at this point, but it's all like showing them that keep on going because it's working. Keep on going because you're having an effect, a positive effect from your standpoint. Instead of, if like I remember in certain red states in America, when there was the student protest, the police came and cracked this, whoever did anything like remotely illegal would be arrested right away. And the protest stopped in like Texas and all these other places. If that would happen in places, there obviously, if someone is threatening violence and all this kind of stuff, it's illegal. He should be arrested. But no, they keep on placating it. No, and like you said, jihad might mean something else, and it's like, and then it shows them that it's okay. It's not just okay. It's worth it. Um, I want to just maybe to finish off ask you about. I want to be a little bit critical about Israel from Israel. Maybe not, I don't know. It's just something that I've been thinking about. Could we have done anything differently in the way, because everybody, oh, Israel's is so bad at explaining itself, and in Israel everybody's angry at the government because ministers say such bad things and it gets such bad press. And I'm thinking with myself whether, obviously it doesn't help when ministers say stupid things, and a lot of our politicians are very dumb, like you said about the British politicians. Here it's even worse because every one of them that says something dumb is being used by people who hate Israel. But regardless, the question is if it even matters. Meaning, the people who hate Israel are going to hate Israel anyway. The media in your country, for example, the BBC, Sky News, they will hate Israel no matter what, it seems to me. They even make up stuff. They don't even use what the minister said. We remember the documentary where they're paying a child, the son of a Hamas minister, as some sort of like good documentary. And all these different stuff. So do you think that in the big picture, for the living in the UK, for example, would it have made a difference, something that Israel would have done to try to change what's happening? Or is it just pretty much this was going to happen either way?
Yeah, it would have made no difference. I'm sure you're right that there are things Israel could have done differently, that there are certain battles in Gaza it could have fought more effectively or less ferociously, or maybe the blockade went on too long. There are loads and loads of critical comments we could make. But none of that matters in the scheme of what we're talking about. Because let me just put it like this. The Palestine Solidarity Campaign, which is the largest pro-Palestine group here in Britain, they applied for the right to march against Israel while 7th of October was still happening, while women were still being raped at the Nova Music Festival, while families were still being blown up with hand grenades in the kibbutzim. While that was happening, literally during the course of the worst mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust, while it was still taking place, the PSC, the Palestine Solidarity Campaign, applied to the Metropolitan Police for the right to march against Israel, because they knew straight away what they were going to say. They knew straight away they were going to say, it's all Israel's fault. Israel is the problem. Israel is the scum of the earth. Israel is the most evil state. They knew it. Same in Australia. There was a protest against Israel outside the Sydney Opera House.
Yes.
On the 8th of October or the 9th of October.
Gas the Jews and all that.
Gas the Jews, F the Jews. Israel hadn't even really taken any firm action by that point. Same in London. There was a protest outside the Israeli embassy on about 36 hours after the pogrom. I think it's possible some Hamas militants were still inside Israel's borders, or certainly it had just happened. And they protested outside the Israeli embassy. And if you look at the footage of that protest, what you recognize is that it's a celebration. They're playing pop music. They're letting off fireworks. They're dancing in the streets. This was the celebration of a pogrom. And I make this point in my book after the pogrom. I make the point that if people in London had poured onto the streets to celebrate Kristallnacht, we would remember that. We would know that that was a very bad thing. So we should remember that they did it for the 7th of October. And so the point is that whatever Israel did, it would have been condemned as a Nazi-style country. Whatever it did. It could have fought the smallest... The point I always make to people when I have media discussions with people who are anti-Israel, I say to them, so what should Israel have done? And they have no answer, because their answer is Israel should have done nothing. Israel should not have fought back in any way whatsoever. And you know what that actually means, Ariel? It means Jews should let themselves be killed. It's not a big deal when 1,200 mostly Jewish people are killed. That's what they're saying. They would never say that out loud, but that's what they mean. Let yourselves be killed. Let yourselves be attacked. Don't fight back. And the point I make is, look, the days when you could kill Jews with impunity are gone. The days when you could launch a pogrom, expel Jews from your country as Britain and Spain did, or launch a pogrom against them as happened in Europe throughout the medieval period, or push them into concentration camps without any consequences, those days are gone. And that's what I think is, Israel is losing the PR war. There's no question about that. But it would have lost it whatever it did. It can't win that war at the moment, which is why I think what Israel needs to do is carry on pursuing Hamas, make sure that it brings to an end this wicked, evil organization, make sure that it can live in peace next to whoever its neighbors might be, and get on with it. Forget about us in the West, because we are a lost cause at the moment. I'm doing everything I can to stop the West being a lost cause, but at the moment we are. So Israel should carry on with its fight, forget about all the crowing from over here, and do what it needs to do.
And Brendan, I just wanted to say about that when October 7th happened, I was here, and I remember the days after, the entire world, if you remember, Biden came and Macron came and Rishi Sunak at the time came, and all these other leaders came, and everybody was like, we so love you and we're so with you. And I told my father, who was here from New York, and he got stuck here, which is a story in and of itself. I said, they love Jews when we're dead. They love Jews when we're weak and we need them, and they feel like they're our saviors and we're the weak ones and they're the strong ones and they're coming. I said, wait like 2-3 weeks when we'll start like bombing them and everything, and there'll be like one story about some children that will be killed, and it might even not be true, it might be true, it's part of war, whatever, that you will see right away. They'll be criticizing us and turning their back right away. We will be the bad guys. They'll forget everything. They'll forget because they want to forget. They like us weak.
They like a weak Jew. They like to watch their Holocaust movies. They like to think, well, what would I have done in the 1930s? They like to self-aggrandize about how they would have helped. But, I don't know who said it, but someone said that if you want to know what you would have done in the 1930s, look at what you're doing now. What are you doing right now? And here in the UK, we have a left and a liberal establishment what are they doing now during the worst attack on Jews since the Holocaust? They are demonizing Jews. They are calling them Nazis. They are saying that the Jewish homeland should be erased from the face of the earth, from the river to the sea. They are aligning with Hamas in its existential war against the Jewish homeland. That's what they're doing. So, you know, people like weak Jews. They like Jews when they're suffering, but when Jews pick up their guns and say, actually, when you attack us now, there are consequences, they don't like that. And that's what is so revolutionary about Israel, if I may use the word revolutionary. That's what's so revolutionary about the IDF, which is that for the first time in history, there exists an army, and the first time in modern history, I should say, there exists an army and a nation that will defend the Jews from those armies of anti-Semites that still exist. And that's worth celebrating, even as we recognize that what's happening in Gaza is awful, and we all want it to come to an end, ideally on terms that include the release of all the hostages and the absolute defeat of Hamas.
And your prime minister, by the way, is his wife is Jewish, which is
Mm.
unbelievable to me that he knows, at least he should know. He should know better. That's all I'm going to say. And Brendan O'Neill, it was such a pleasure talking to you. It's we've been trying to have this for quite a while now, and I really appreciate that we finally done it. So thank you so much for being with us. It was truly a eye-opening conversation, and I really enjoyed it. And thank you so much.
Thank you. My pleasure.